1890, John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil refining. 90%. That's not market leadership, that's monopoly. His company, Standard Oil, was the most powerful corporation in American history, making Rockefeller the richest person who ever lived with wealth equivalent to $400 billion today. Everyone assumes he got rich by owning oil fields, drilling wells, discovering petroleum deposits. He didn't. Rockefeller never owned significant oil production, didn't drill wells, didn't explore for petroleum, didn't extract crude from the ground. So how did he monopolize an entire industry, controlling 90% of American oil by 1890 without owning the actual resource? This is the story of infrastructure monopoly, how controlling the systems between production and consumption generates more wealth than owning production itself. Why Rockefeller's chokepoint strategy made him richer than every oil driller combined, and how understanding this pattern reveals that modern tech monopolies from Amazon to Google are running the exact same playbook Rockefeller perfected 150 years ago. The dark truth: monopoly wealth doesn't come from innovation or production. It comes from controlling infrastructure that everyone must use, extracting rent at every stage, and making both producers and consumers pay for passage through systems you own. Let's start with what Rockefeller actually controlled, because this reveals the entire mechanism. Standard Oil-owned refineries, the facilities that processed crude petroleum into usable products like kerosene for lamps, lubricating oil for machines, petroleum jelly, paraffin wax. By 1880, Standard Oil owned or controlled approximately 90% of American refining capacity, but refineries are just one piece. Rockefeller also owned the pipelines that transported crude oil from wells to refineries, miles and miles of pipeline infrastructure connecting Pennsylvania oil fields to Cleveland and New York refineries. He owned the railroad tank cars that moved refined products from refineries to distribution centers across the country. Thousands of specialized rail cars on long-term leases, giving Standard Oil preferential shipping rates. He owned barrel manufacturing plants producing the wooden barrels that stored and shipped petroleum products. Controlling supply of containers meant controlling distribution. He owned distribution networks in major cities, warehouses, delivery wagons, retail relationships with stores selling kerosene to consumers. What Rockefeller built was vertical integration of everything between the oil well and your lamp. The oil producer who actually drilled the well and extracted crude had exactly one buyer for their product: Standard Oil's pipeline system. The consumer who wanted kerosene for lighting had exactly one supplier in most markets: Standard Oil's distribution network. Rockefeller didn't own the oil in the ground. He owned every choke point the oil had to pass through to become useful. Here's why this mattered and why it made Rockefeller richer than the oil producers. An independent oil driller in Pennsylvania in 1875 pumped crude oil out of the ground. That's the hard work: drilling wells, operating pumps, extracting petroleum. But crude oil sitting in barrels at the well site is worthless. It needs to get to a refinery to be processed into usable products. The driller has three options: build his own pipeline to a refinery hundreds of miles away costing hundreds of thousands of dollars he doesn't have, ship it by railroad at 40 cents per barrel, eating all his profit margin, or sell to Standard Oil's pipeline at 25 cents per barrel, and accept whatever price Standard Oil offers for the crude. The driller chooses option 3 because it's the only economically viable option. Standard Oil now owns the crude for below market price because they control the only cost-effective transportation. They pump it through their pipeline, which cost them 10 cents per barrel to operate, but they just saved 15 cents by not using railroad shipping. They refine it in their facility, turning $3 of crude into $12 of refined kerosene and other products. They ship the refined products in their railroad tank cars at preferential rates 20% below what competitors pay because they negotiated volume discounts with railroads. They distribute through their network and sell to consumers at market price. Total profit: approximately $5 per barrel, extracted across 5 stages of the supply chain Rockefeller controlled. The oil driller who did the actual hard work of extraction made maybe 50 cents profit per barrel if he was lucky. Rockefeller made 10 times more by owning the infrastructure than the driller made by producing the oil. But here's where the mechanism becomes truly extractive and reveals this is designed monopoly, not market competition. Rockefeller didn't just have competitive advantages, he actively destroyed competitors and made competition impossible. The railroad rebate system was the key weapon. Standard Oil negotiated contracts with railroads that gave them preferential shipping rates, 25 cents per barrel instead of the 40 cents competitors paid. That alone would be massive advantage. But the contracts included secret rebate clauses that are the most predatory business practice in American history. Railroads agreed to pay Standard Oil a 10-cent rebate on every barrel Rockefeller's competitors shipped. Read that again. When a competing refinery shipped oil by railroad at 40 cents per barrel, the railroad paid Standard Oil 10 cents of that 40-cent fee. Competitors were literally funding Standard Oil's transportation costs. A competitor paid 40 cents to ship, Rockefeller paid 25 cents to ship, and then received 10 cents from the railroad for every barrel the competitor shipped. Effective cost to Rockefeller, 15 cents, while competitor paid 40 cents. This wasn't just price advantage, this was turning competitor costs into Rockefeller revenue. And it gets worse. The railroad contracts also required railroads to provide Standard Oil with detailed shipping reports on all competitor shipments, where they shipped from, how much volume, to which destinations, which customers. Rockefeller had complete business intelligence on every competitor's operations, provided by the railroads, paid for by the competitors themselves through those rebates. When competitors discovered this system, some sued. Rockefeller's response was legally correct and morally horrifying. It was legal. We negotiated better contracts. You could have done the same. He was right, it was legal. He used market power from volume shipping to negotiate contracts competitors couldn't match because they lacked volume, creating feedback loop where his volume advantage generated contract advantages that increased his volume advantage further. The pipeline monopoly reveals infrastructure control as permanent chokepoint. Early oil fields in Pennsylvania had oil producers scattered across the region, each operating wells on different land parcels. Getting crude to refineries required either expensive barrels loaded on wagons or railroad shipment or pipelines. Building pipelines required massive capital investment, rights of way, pipe materials, pumping stations, maintenance. Individual drillers couldn't afford it. In 1879, a group of independent oil producers pooled resources to build the Tidewater Pipeline, a 109-mile pipeline from Pennsylvania fields to Reading, trying to break Standard Oil's transportation monopoly and ship crude to independent refineries. This was existential threat to Rockefeller's control. Standard Oil's response revealed how monopolies maintain power. Immediately built competing pipeline along the same route, slashed pipeline fees below cost, and used railroad rebate advantages to make shipping via Tidewater more expensive than using Standard Oil's system, even though Tidewater charged lower base rates. Within 2 years, Tidewater was bankrupt. Standard Oil bought the pipeline assets for fraction of construction cost. The pipeline monopoly was restored. This is predatory pricing in infrastructure. Use capital reserves to sustain losses competitors can't match, drive them to bankruptcy, acquire their assets at liquidation prices, restore monopoly pricing after competition eliminated. The pattern repeated across the industry. Any attempt to build competing infrastructure was met with price war. Standard Oil could sustain through profits from captive markets elsewhere until competitor failed. Now here's the mechanism that proves infrastructure monopoly extracts more wealth than production. Standard Oil refined approximately 90% of American oil by 1890. Total profit margin on refining, approximately $2 to $3 per barrel. But Rockefeller also profited from pipeline transportation, 50 cents per barrel, railroad rebates from competitor shipments, 10 cents per barrel on competitor volume, barrel manufacturing, 25 cents per barrel, distribution networks, $1 per barrel. When you own every stage between well and consumer, you extract profit at every stage. A truly independent competitor who owned their own well, built their own refinery, somehow shipped without using Standard Oil infrastructure, and distributed independently might make $4 total profit per barrel. Standard Oil made $5 to $6 per barrel by controlling infrastructure and extracting from everyone forced to use it. The math is simple. Infrastructure ownership generates more profit than production ownership because infrastructure is monopolizable in ways production isn't. Anyone can drill a well if they find oil. Only entities with massive capital can build pipeline networks, refinery complexes, and distribution systems. Once built, those infrastructure assets become mandatory chokepoints everyone must use. Rockefeller understood this perfectly. In testimony before Congress, he stated, "The day of individual competition in large affairs is past and gone. You might just as well argue that we should go back to hand labor and throw away our efficient machines." Translation: monopoly infrastructure is inevitable, competition is obsolete, resistance is futile. He was describing design monopoly as natural evolution when it was actually systematic destruction of competition through infrastructure control. The scale of the monopoly by 1890 was absolute. Standard Oil Trust controlled approximately 90% of oil refining, 75% of pipeline mileage, 90% of railroad tank car capacity for petroleum products. In major markets, they controlled 100% of distribution. If you wanted kerosene in New York or Chicago, you bought from Standard Oil or you sat in the dark. Oil producers had no choice but to sell to Standard Oil at prices Standard Oil set. Consumers had no choice but to buy from Standard Oil at prices Standard Oil set. The market existed only at the margins. The 10% of refining capacity Standard Oil didn't control operated in geographic niches or specialized products where Standard Oil hadn't yet expanded. This wasn't market dominance through better product or superior efficiency. Standard Oil's kerosene wasn't higher quality than competitors. Their refining technology wasn't dramatically superior. What they had was infrastructure monopoly that made competition economically impossible. Starting a competing refinery required not just building the refinery, you also needed pipeline access, railroad shipping contracts, distribution networks, and barrel supply chains. Capital requirements were millions of dollars before you processed your first barrel of oil. And even if you somehow raised that capital, Standard Oil would use predatory pricing to bankrupt you before you recouped investment. The monopoly was structural, designed, and maintained through systematic elimination of any threat to infrastructure control. But here's where the modern parallels become exact and reveal this pattern is timeless. Amazon doesn't manufacture most products sold on Amazon.com. They own the platform, the infrastructure connecting producers to consumers. Third-party sellers create products. Amazon provides marketplace access, warehousing through FBA, payment processing, customer data, delivery logistics. Amazon extracts fees at every stage, 15% marketplace commission, warehousing fees, delivery fees, payment processing fees, advertising fees to get products seen. A seller might make $5 profit on a $30 product. Amazon makes $8 to $12 in fees. Then Amazon uses sales data from third-party sellers to identify successful products, creates Amazon Basics versions manufactured cheaply, lists them prominently, undercuts the original seller on price, and captures the market. The seller paid Amazon to access customers, then Amazon used that payment and sales data to compete against them. This is exactly Rockefeller's railroad rebate system. Turn competitor costs into your revenue and intelligence, then use that advantage to eliminate them. Google doesn't create most content on the internet. They own search, the infrastructure connecting content creators to audiences. Websites create content. Google provides traffic through search rankings, extracts value through advertising revenue, and uses traffic data to determine which content types to prioritize or demote. Control the infrastructure that everyone must use to reach customers, extract fees from everyone using it, use the data from extraction to optimize your own competitive position. Facebook doesn't create social content. They own the social graph, the infrastructure connecting people to each other. Users create content, Facebook provides distribution, extracts advertising revenue, and uses engagement data to modify algorithms that determine what content succeeds. Apple doesn't create most apps. They own the App Store, the infrastructure connecting developers to iPhone users. Developers create apps. Apple charges 30% commission on all sales, controls which apps get approved, and uses app performance data to decide which functionality to build into iOS, eliminating successful app categories. The pattern is identical across 150 years. Don't produce the thing people want. Control the infrastructure required to get the thing from producers to consumers. Extract rent at every stage. Use data from extraction to eliminate competitors who paid you for access. Rockefeller perfected this with oil. Modern tech monopolies perfected it with digital platforms. The mechanism doesn't change, only the scale and the product. And here's why this matters for understanding empire economics. Infrastructure monopolies are how declining empires extract wealth when they can no longer create it through production. Rising empires innovate, build new industries, create new products, generate wealth through production. Declining empires financialize, monopolize distribution of what others produce, extract rents from mandatory infrastructure. Rockefeller built Standard Oil during America's industrial rise, but his monopoly became extractive. He stopped innovating in refining technology, focused entirely on infrastructure control and competitor elimination. By 1890, Standard Oil wasn't making oil cheaper or better, it was just making Rockefeller richer by extracting from everyone forced to use his infrastructure. This is extraction over creation, pattern 8 of empire decline. When the wealthiest entities in your economy profit from controlling infrastructure rather than producing innovation, you're in late-stage extraction phase. This is the empire economy. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil by 1890 without owning significant oil production because he owned every chokepoint the oil had to pass through: refineries, pipelines, railroads, distribution networks, barrel manufacturing. Oil producers who did hard work of drilling and extraction made 50 cents per barrel. Rockefeller made $5 to $6 per barrel by controlling infrastructure and extracting rent at every stage between well and consumer. The mechanism was designed monopoly. Use railroad rebates to make competitors fund your shipping and provide intelligence on their operations. Use predatory pricing in infrastructure to bankrupt competing pipelines. Use capital reserves to sustain losses until competition eliminated. Use market power to negotiate contracts competitors can't match. Infrastructure monopoly extracts more wealth than production monopoly. Because infrastructure is mandatory chokepoint, everyone must use, and capital requirements prevent competition. Modern tech platforms run the identical playbook. Amazon owns marketplace infrastructure extracting fees from sellers, then using data to compete against them. Google owns search infrastructure, extracting advertising revenue from content creators. Facebook owns social graph infrastructure, extracting from users and advertisers. Apple owns App Store infrastructure, extracting from developers. The pattern is 150 years old and never changes. Control the roads between production and consumption. Extract rent from everyone using roads. Use data and revenue from extraction to eliminate threats to infrastructure control. Monopoly wealth comes from owning chokepoints, not from innovation, and understanding this reveals why declining empires shift from production to extraction. Infrastructure rent is more profitable and sustainable than actually making things. Rockefeller never owned the oil. He owned the only paths oil could take to become valuable. That's how he became richest person in history, and that's how modern tech monopolies extract trillions today using his exact mechanism.